Welcome back. It is the final episode of a couple-year-long project that Duan and I have been doing called The Fabulous Four. And we're at the end here, Duan. Did you think it would take this long for us to get through all of these fights?
I didn't, but we're closing the book on the Fabulous Four today. And I think, over the time we've been doing this series, my interest in this era and these four guys has just grown and grown. The more we've looked into their stories, the more it's just become fascinating to me. They're just four such unique fighters and characters, and there's so much history tied up between them, but also just in how the sport developed during that era. This series took us through the whole 1980s pretty much. Leonard Duran 1 was in June of 1980. Leonard Duran 3, the final fight, was in December of 89. So during that time we kind of moved from the heavyweights being where all the money was in boxing into having the interest in the lower weight classes. We moved from 15-round title fights to 12-round title fights. We went from 2 world titles to the kind of the big four that we have nowadays. We saw Showtime come into the picture with the Hagler-Mugabe fight in '86. We saw pay-per-view blow up with Leonard Hagler in '81. So a lot of kind of what the current boxing landscape is like now was massively influenced by kind of that 80s era. And I think, one thing that's really cool about about these guys is that, the legacy they have, just how admired and respected they are by both by the fans and fighters today. Either people who grew up watching them or even ones who grew up too young to see them on first go around and, then discovered them later when they became involved in the sport. And, it captivated them in the same way. And I think these guys now are as revered as they've ever been, if not even more revered. There's just so many fighters they've inspired over the years. I think because of that, their legacy is just going to continue to grow.
If you hear Bob Arum do any media about boxing history, he always speaks so highly of this time frame. And, he has so much respect for all of these guys. Hagler specifically is like the guy who he felt was, the most loyal out of folks. But just listening to him think back, because, that's a guy with so much knowledge. He was involved in just about everything. And to hear him talk about this era is actually pretty fascinating. It's fun. But I guess the other thing before we get into what we're going to talk about in this epilogue episode is, in this journey with you and me, do you feel like, because you are on top of the current boxing scene, and I know that you have so much interest in boxing history. But this era is before your time as far as being a boxing fan, and in some cases even being alive. But do you feel a little bit like, maybe expert is a strong word, but sort of like a historian or a hardcore fan of this era now that we are pretty much through the entire era?
Yeah, I think, this is an era that's going to now have kind of a lasting appeal to me. And, it's something that, really just kind of developed over both like, from reading Kimball's work and then just over the course of doing this series. My appreciation for it has just grown and grown. I think, just partly because of the fights, but also just because of the characters that were involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to close out the series. We're going to get everybody up to speed about the end of the careers of our Fabulous Four. And then Duan is going to talk a little bit about the trainers and sort of where they went and what happened after these guys were done. And then we're going to get into some, there's a couple of hypotheticals, and then, just kind of, want to gauge, Duan and myself as far as, what was the best fight or what was the biggest event? It's just stuff like that, because I think, when we're looking at this from like a historical perspective, we're really digging into facts. But I do want to know what Duan thinks about, about the fights and which ones was his favorite and which event maybe if he could go back in time that he could see. So first off, let's talk about Hagler, because he is done. His career ends while the series is still going on. And I think most people know his story, which is he was just so brokenhearted over kind of the politics of boxing. And after that Leonard fight, he pretty much figured that there was nothing left. He was not to say that he wasn't interested in rematches if the money was right, but I think he knew that because of his style, his physicality, that his athleticism was not there as much as it could have been, and that sort of that Sugar Ray's that's his fight game, right? Like that's his. He was not going to fight Marvin when Marvin was Marvin. He was going to wait it out, and then when he finally got Marvin, when he did, he knew that there was an athleticism that wasn't there anymore with Marvin. So I think Marvin knew that as well, and that was part of the reason why he was able to call it quits like he did. But I think people know that he did move out to Italy, and he did movies, and he would come back though. He would come back and do broadcasts for HBO at the Leonard and Hearns fight, the draw. He was very much relevant because people were wondering, okay, like what's next, and is Marvin Hagler going to be involved? So he wasn't completely out of the scene, but he was on the periphery. But I think deep down he would have probably had to get knocked over with a money offer to come back. Is that sort of what you felt about Marvin at that time?
Yeah, like Hagler finished his career 62, 3-2. He never fought again after the Leonard fight, but he hung around for a while before officially announcing his retirement. I think he announced his retirement in June of '88. And as you said, he did move out to Italy. He married an Italian lady, and I think he just made a new life for himself out there. And by all accounts, he's been quite happy. He looked after himself. He still, he's kept himself in shape, and just kind of lives a life in solitude. He did eventually, as soon as he was eligible for it, get elected into the Hall of Fame in 1993, and that's one of the things you kind of see him pop up at from year to year is whenever there's a new Hall of Fame class announced, Marvin's a lot of the time he's one of the guests there. That's kind of where we've mainly seen him over the past few years. But aside from, I think maybe he's never really gotten over the bitterness of losing to Leonard. And there's a few stories about that. I think Duran mentions that when the Four Kings book came out, like Marvin didn't want to be involved in the promotion, and Ray was kind of asking him, why isn't Marvin involved? And he said, he's just upset that you beat him in that fight. And Ray said, which is classic and unmistakable Ray Leonard, he said, you're damn right I beat him. And yeah, then I think there was another thing, like at some kind of Caesar's anniversary, where him, Tommy, and Leonard were all there at the same time, and Ray was trying to make a business proposition to Tommy and Marvin to that they could make some money together, off their legacy. And I think Marvin was just kind of like, you guys need to grow up and move on with your life. So I heard Goody Petronelli, his trainer, said just like Marvin's going to take that Leonard loss to the grave, but he's never going to get over it. But I think other than that, he's quite wealthy, and he's happy in his with his lot.
So, Boxing Illustrated put together a list of fighters of the 90s, and actually, I think this was fighters of the 80s. Actually, I think I got that wrong. And so Hagler was number 1, Leonard was 2, Hearns was 7, and Duran was 8th. So, Hagler though he lost to Ray, still from a boxing insider standpoint, because Ray didn't fight as much as Hagler did, but Hagler was still seen in that vein as the number one guy. So Sugar Ray, we last see him, beating Duran in that fight that was, not very good at all, but it showed that, the time was over for everyone. But what happens in boxing and in a lot of sports, which is as you get older, even as your skills diminish, your ability to make money and your ability to draw people and your popularity and your fandom can increase even as your skills decrease and you're not as good anymore. And Ray was still able to get a couple of pretty decent paydays, though he was his skill set wasn't there. And one of those fights was against Terry Norris in 1991. Interestingly, as I look back on this fight, Sugar Ray Leonard was actually favored to beat Terry Norris in this fight. Obviously I was a teenager back then, but I didn't remember. I always remembered this fight as like just being petrified for Ray, because I knew Norris was a killer and I knew Ray was, a step and a half slow. And I was just worried, entirely going in there like that Norris was just going to destroy him. And, Sugar Ray did not get knocked. I mean, he got knocked down in this fight, did not get knocked out. But it was hard to watch if you're a Ray fan. Now, there are lots of things around how injured he was going into the fight. He's still dealing with a lot of personal problems in his life. But the public audience, the people did not really buy this as much as other fights, because they held it at Madison Square Garden. And from all the records that I can tell, Madison Square Garden was like half full. So for a Ray Leonard fight, that was kind of surprising. And it wasn't even on pay-per-view. It was on Showtime. So Showtime bought the rights to the fight, and it was not a pay-per-view fight. And it was tough. Ray's ribs are hurting. There's some stories about whether or not he had to get painkillers before the fight. Norris knocks him down in the second round. And actually, he could have got DQ'd in this fight because Leonard's gloves are on the ground, and Norris follows up with a punch that lands while Leonard's gloves are on the ground. The announcers didn't really say anything about it, but that was very apparent to me when I was watching. So he is clearly not at the age of where he can really mix it up with the young up and comers. And after this one, he's like, I'm done, which he's not actually done. But what are your memories of this one?
Yeah, like we said last time, after the last fight with Duran, Ray needed 60 stitches, and he was really kind of beat up after the fight, and we're thinking, like, what reason would he come back for another fight for? And he did decide to come back for this Norris fight, and I think these last two fights of his career you can almost discount, because as it's not really the same guy. He was really well beaten by, like, they're kind of both fairly embarrassing losses actually, and he was very well beaten by Norris in that fight. And you mentioned kind of about this fight being sold to Showtime. Ray was doing commentary work for HBO at that time, so that landed him in a little bit of trouble as well.
There's also a story where because of his connections with with HBO, I think HBO is broadcasting Wimbledon. And so Ray is supposed to be sitting with, he's supposed to be sitting with a couple of HBO executives for the Wimbledon final. And, as they're waiting for Ray, and I think maybe it's his manager or somebody's supposed to be with him, instead, like, two women who are described in Kimball's book as very showy are there instead. And that probably was a little bit of an FU to HBO from Ray as well, which is like, he just gave his tickets away to, just two random women who may or may not have been, professional professional call girls or something. Like, who knows? Like, it didn't really explain that way, but it kind of read that way. And so that and then he's negotiating with Showtime, and HBO was like, you know what? Yeah, we should get first dibs on this, and because of that, you're not broadcasting with us anymore. So
yeah.
Did you have anything else?
No, I was gonna move on to the next fight, which I think you're gonna do anyway. So
yeah, so then 6 years later, he fights Hector Macho Camacho, and the reason why this is an interesting tidbit is not necessarily because of Camacho, but Camacho ends up being the last fight for two of our guys here. He beats Ray in really sad fashion. Like,
the only time Ray was ever knocked out in his career. And
Camacho is not a big puncher at all. Like, no. he was a hit and run fighter. Used a lot of speed. A lot of tactics that Ray would have beat Marvin with. Really, that's the style fighter that he was. Left-handed, but. Yeah, it was just you're Sugar Ray Leonard, and you come back in 1997, and it's like, dude, what are you doing? He tears his calf, and he loses in 5, and it was just really, it's like you always hear the stories of Ali losing to Trevor Berbick, and I watched that fight with Trevor Berbick, and I know because I didn't see Ali in person growing up. I'm a little young. But to those who saw Ali as like a boxing hero, it was sad to see him lose to someone like Trevor Berbick. But when I watched that fight back with Trevor Berbick, I'm like, oh, I know the story. And it's actually kind of interesting because Ali's competitive, even though it's very clear that his skills are so diminished and Berbick is a young guy. But this, me seeing Ray growing up, watching him at the tail end here against Camacho was just so sad. It was just like he was shot.
Yeah, and that was also the same year Ray was, first eligible for the Hall of Fame, and he got in, and immediately fought somewhere in between there, which I guess he probably wasn't meant to do. But yeah, he ended his career after that at 36-3-1, and if you discount those last two losses as like not really meaning much, then you've only got the Roberto as the only person who's really beat him, and arguably Tommy in that draw maybe deserved one as well.
Yeah,
but he's almost got a perfect record. He beat Tommy and he beat Roberto twice. So if you discount those two losses, Ray was pretty much undefeated throughout his career.
And so Ray, this time, he doesn't actually retire. He goes, you know what? I'm going to keep going. And what happens is that he actually has 2 fights scheduled that never actually happen. And then he quietly retires. But I was just like, did he need the money? Like, what was he trying to prove after this horrible loss to Camacho?
There was one thing actually that I almost forgot in there, which is that if he had have beaten Camacho, they were lining him up to fight Leonard or to fight De La Hoya, which that would have been scary at that point.
Oh my God! I mean, it would have been like an amazing spectacle because Oscar's coming up and he's the golden boy. Leonard had previously beat the other golden boy, but Oscar in that time frame, he was definitely on his way to being the next big thing. That would have been an amazing sort of like passing of the torch, but he would have killed him. So that pretty much puts the cap on Sugar Ray. I mean, everyone, most folks who followed know that he was involved in the Contenders. He still does broadcasting today. He's on DAZN currently. So he's still around, and God, he looks so great for his age too. He's an amazing specimen, that guy.
Oh yeah, he looks brilliant, and as you said, like he's still heavily involved in the sport, and everybody loves having him around. I remember like seeing him at any of his trips over to the UK, and that all the fighters who gather around just for an opportunity to talk with him and things like that. I saw just a couple of weeks ago a photo of him with Katie Taylor from her fight when he was doing commentary on the Zone. So yeah, he stayed in and around the sport, like, and he's still got the respect of all his peers.
So you followed Duran a lot more closely than I did, because we were trying to sort of split the responsibilities, and I read Leonard's book and you read Duran's book. Take us through the last few years of his career, which ends. What year does his career actually end?
2001.
Holy crap! What an amazing guy.
He was 50 at the time. So Duran finished at 103-16, which is just a crazy record. Like, he had another 26 fights after Uno Mas.
Jeez.
Like, he won 18 of them and he lost 8. And I guess, where we left off with him last time, just after we kind of were saying that, like, everybody knew that Roberto would fight on because he needed to. And, Bob Arum and people like that were saying, well, just try match him a little bit more favorably, because he is going to fight on. And generally speaking, that is what happened with the rest of his career, with a couple of exceptions. He had, like, kind of a period where they would just put him in, a few lower level fights to build him back up, and then they'd try and move him into a bit more of a money fight. And, that kind of end part of his career is characterized by a few small rivalries. There's Pat Lawler, Vinny Pazienza, and Hector Camacho. And I guess, immediately after the last Leonard fight, it wasn't a good time for Duran. We didn't really get onto this in the last podcast, but, like, in the build up to Leonard Duran 3, US forces were on the verge of invading Panama at that time. There was actually an embargo on trade with Panama, and Bob Arum was told, like, if you sell this fight to their national network, we were going to put you in jail. And Bob ended up selling it to a private company, that broadcast in Panama, so the fight was still able to air there. But what happened was, the fight was on December the 7th. December 20th, the US forces invaded Panama to overthrow Noriega, and in that, a lot of Roberto's hometown was destroyed. He was very kind of scared at the time, and he took the money he had out of his bank. He took like 275,000, he says, out of his bank, put it in a suitcase, and as soon as the airways opened up, he got on a flight to Miami, and that bag with the money never made it to the other end. But yeah, so Roberto set up his next few years of his life in Miami. When he did, he kept spending all around him over there, and when he did run out of money, he returned to the ring, and it was on the Tyson Ruddock undercard, and that was the first match of Pat Lawler. Now, the story is on this one that he was sparring with Mickey Rourke. And, just because Rourke's not really a boxer and he's a lot bigger than Roberto, and they were tussling and Roberto wasn't properly warmed up or whatever, he pulled out his shoulder in it, and he went into the fight with Lawler with, like, his shoulder gone, and he wasn't feeling well, and I think he tore his bicep then in the fight as well, and he ended up having to retire in the 6th round, and it was kind of treated as, oh, this is Roberto quitting again, and another no mas. So yeah, that was a pretty low point for him. From there, like, they kind of built him back up. They gave him 6 or 7 lower level wins, and then you know, he moved on to fight Vinny Pazienza. And in the first fight with Vinny Pazienza, he did okay. Like, he knocked Paz down and he busted him up a fair bit in the fight, but he lost a decision. They rematched not that long after, and he was kind of a lot less competitive second time around. Pazienza beat him quite clearly that time. You know, but then it was kind of like another few wins and on to Hector Camacho. And again, in the first fight with Camacho, he did quite well. I think Camacho said that, like, Roberto beat him in, you know, his post-fight interview or something like that. But Camacho did get the decision. You know, he kind of had a fewer low-profile fights after that. You know, just to kind of get himself back on the wagon. And then there was one fight that, you know, kind of stands out as a fight that really should have never happened, which was he was put in with William Joppy.
Oh yeah.
And Joppy at that stage was the lineal middleweight title holder, and Duran was 47 at the time. And, like, I think his team were, like, pretty... Like, he arranged a fight with Don King, and I think his team were pretty mad. Like, they were like, we've spent our time trying to keep you out of fighting guys that are much younger and are going to chew you up. And, you know, King goes and puts you in this fight, and you take it. And it kind of went pretty much as everyone expected it would. I think, like, Joppy stopped Roberto standing in, like, the third round or something like that. But yeah, after that, he did have an opportunity to go back and fight in Panama, and it was against, as the guy we talked about earlier, Pat Lawler. And I guess, like, Roberto always felt that, you know, if he had been 100%, he would have beat Pat Lawler. So he looked at this as, you know, a way for him to kind of go out on a high note in Panama. Like, the fight was on his 49th birthday in, you know, the stadium that would become known as the Roberto Duran Arena. And, you know, all his family and friends were there. And, you know, it's for, like, kind of some minor title, the NBA title, I think it was called. And Roberto won a decision. So, like, you know, he went his whole career without ever being beaten in Panama. And, you know, that's something he's very proud of, and I think he looks back on that kind of as a really fond moment towards the end of his career, of being able to go back home and get, you know, avenge that defeat to Lawler. Then his last fight would be the rematch with Camacho, and kind of like the Pazienza fight, the second time around he didn't do as well at all. He wasn't really that competitive in the fight. Camacho beat him a lot cleaner that time. And, you know, that was in 2001, and it was actually like, that was actually like 2002 then he was in a car accident, which was the reason he ended up retiring, because, you know, he couldn't be cleared to fight. But, like, the way he kind of tells it in his book was he looked at that as kind of, in a lot of ways, as sort of a blessing in disguise, because, you know, he saw it as he was a fighter, and as long as he could go out there and fight, he was going to keep doing it until he had nothing left. And, you know, after that accident, you know, that was what retired. That was what eventually retired him. You know, he was then elected as soon as he was eligible to the Hall of Fame in 2007. You know, he's even though he spent, like, more money than, you know, most people could in 100 lifetimes. You know, I think he lives quite a comfortable life back in Panama. He still got the same house he bought when he beat Leonard the first time. He's got his restaurant there where he likes to bring in his guests and watch his old fights and things like that. And he's able to make money doing, you know, the different events and nostalgia tours and speaking dates and stuff in America and the UK. So, you know, he's been able to move on with his life, and he's had, you know, some, like, opportunities to tell a story again over these last few years. Like, when we started this series, we were talking about the movie Hands of Stone with Robert De Niro. Like, that movie came out.
Yep.
He had he had his biography, the I Am Duran book. I think there was a musical made about his life, and did the 30 for 30 No Mas special. So
yeah, that's a good look at both he and Leonard in their later day, after the fights are over. Like there's good footage of them having a conversation, and I think the premise is a little bit silly for that movie, which is Leonard asking Duran, what actually happened to get some sort of, like, I guess, can you just say that I beat you or whatever it was. I mean, who cares really? But they tried to tell that story in that movie, but you do get to see them together post-fight career as just guys, as just regular guys. So that was actually pretty cool about that documentary.
Yeah, and I think, like, and as we said, we talked about, like, Roberto's ups and downs with Panama over the years. He has a statue in Panama City of him now. The arena's named after him. So, he ended up like coming back from No Mas and putting all that behind him, and he's one of the country's proudest sons now. And I think, like, Ricky Haddon kind of tells a funny story in his book where he's, like, going to, I think, a WBA convention in Panama, and Ricky and Roberto are friends, and Roberto says he'll pick him up at the airport, and Ricky gets off the flight, and there's Roberto in behind security ready to collect him off the plane. And they pick up his bags and they're ready to leave, and Ricky's kind of going to Roberto, I had to kind of go through customs and things like that. And Roberto just, like, pulls open a security gate to the side and sticks his fingers up at the security guards, and they walk on their way, and, like, Ricky's just like, well, it's Roberto Duran and it's Panama, no one's going to tell him what to do.
That's awesome. So we could actually do, like, another 2 episodes just on what Tommy Hearns was doing after the Fabulous Four was over. Hearns is and he's not the most active, but he does fight until 2007. It's 2007, 2006. 2006, his last fight is February 4th, 2006. There's lots of stuff going on with Tommy here. He and Emmanuel Stewart, like, actually break up, and they go through a really bad breakup. Like, Tommy is bad-mouthing him, he's bad-mouthing Tommy. It's really sad, like, what happens. And I think, at least the impetus from what I understand is Emmanuel's just worried about his health, because the people started to notice Tommy slurring a little bit more his words, and Tommy was just like, I want to take control of my career because I don't think I've been, paid as much as I should have been paid. And he's taking care of a lot of people as well. And, I guess the person in this whole series who goes through some real, like, some real tragedy is Hearns, because of the deaths that happen before fights, and the weird things that happen at his home, and so he has a weird sort of last several years of his career where he's trying to do some fights back home, and then he ends up fighting on not undercards, but on not in the main events of certain fights, and it was just interesting. But, like, let's go back to the sort of the post Fab Four era of his ride here. So after he has that split draw with Ray, he has a fight with Virgil Hill where he wins the WBA lightweight heavyweight title. On our website, you wrote a couple of paragraphs about that fight, and just to recap, folks, like what were your thoughts rewatching that thing?
Yeah, I think, like, that's one of the great, like, veteran performances you'll ever see. But I just want to kind of go back a little bit, because after Leonard, Tommy fought another 17 times.
Yep.
And he won 15 of them. So he had the most successful late career. And I think immediately after Leonard, the fight he was looking at was Michael Nunn. And Nunn was the IBF champion at the time, and there was rumours that there was going to be a £10 million payday for that. And I think what ended up happening was Nunn had just a really boring fight with Marlon Sterling, and then the money wasn't on the table anymore, and Tommy ended up coming back against Michael Olajide instead and making way less money on it. And I think it's in after that fight he was kind of chasing Roy Jones at the time. And he was saying that, I don't know, that maybe the Manny wasn't that interested in negotiating for the Jones fight, and maybe that was exactly what you said. The Manny was just a bit concerned about his health and didn't want him going for that fight. And then there was a split, and I think there was kind of a few reasons for the split. There was also the idea that Hearns probably wasn't the top fighter for Stewart anymore. He had Lennox Lewis at the time and some other guys, and they were demanding some of his time as well. And there's a thing you said about the money, but Manny being Hearns' manager and his promoter, he was getting he was obviously getting a split for both of those roles. I think maybe Tommy felt it was a little bit too much. But I think the underlining thing with Tommy at this time is, if you kind of look at his coaches, I think he wanted to be seen as the man at this point. For so long
he's the last guy standing.
Yeah, I think for so long he had been one of the main guys, and there was something there's something in the build up to one of these fights where he said because Tyson had lost to Buster Douglas, he's like, we don't have a Mike Tyson. I'm boxing needs me. Mm-hmm. And I think he kind of wanted to have that reputation as being the top star in the sport. And after he split with Stewart, he did make some kind of he made the kind of wholesale changes in his team. There was still a lot of the guys from the Kronk team around him, but he brought in a new coach, a guy called Alex Shearer, who was very inexperienced as a coach, but he was kind of a guy who was a boxing fanatic and was renowned as a scout. And he also gave 100% of his focus to Tommy, and I think also Tommy was just paying him a flat wage rather than a percentage fee, so Tommy made a lot of money on those fights he did during that time. But he also brought in Dennis Rappaport as his manager, and Harold Smith, who you may remember if you go all the way back to episode 3, Muhammad Ali Professional Sports. Harold Smith, the guy who was spent a lot of time in prison for embezzlement, but he was giving these guys, was promoting at this time and giving guys really good paydays. He was kind of brought in as an advisory role in the Hearns camp. And I think, the boxing world seemed to really take Stewart's side on this one. I remember reading a quote from Arum where he said, what is Tommy thinking going with, leaving behind such a great relationship with Manny Stewart and going with these guys and things like that. I think Pat Petronelli said something similar. But, he got a couple of wins to set up that Virgil Hill fight. And then the thing about the Virgil Hill fight is just Hill was a really good fighter. He ended up being a Hall of Famer in his own right. He's a guy who he won a silver medal in the LA Olympics in '84, and he was just kind of cursed with being on the same team as Mark Breland, Pernell Whitaker, Frank Tate, Meldrick Taylor, Terrell Biggs, who all won gold. So he went a little bit under the radar. But by the time he fought Hearns, he was 30-0. He'd been a champion for 4 years, and he had 10 successful defenses. Now, sometimes you find in these type of fights where an older guy knocks off a rising star, you find out that either the prospect was too early in his development and he just wasn't ready for the fight, wasn't ready for the step up yet, or else sometimes you find out that the prospect was just never that good. And neither of those things can be said about Hill, because he had great performances before this and great performances after this. As I said, he went on to be a Hall of Famer. He went into this as a 4-1 favourite. But as I said, he'd been going under under the radar, and like people were treating Tommy as like the A side to it because, you know, he was the name they knew. And I guess like that's what they were trying to do with Hill. They were trying to juice the last of Tommy's name but getting him a big win. But like Tommy just really outboxed him in really convincing fashion, and it's one of those ones that's hard to explain away. This guy who people have been saying was over the hill for years and years and years, you know, he just put on this absolute clinic at this late stage of his career and beat like a guy who was like, you know, at his absolute peak at that time, you know. And like I think that, you know, is one of Tommy's great performances. I think, you know, that's as big as part of his legacy as anything. And but yeah, I guess like after that, you know, that new team he kind of assembled started to fall apart gradually again, and he did end up back in the cronk. You know, I think Tommy had looked at going for 6th world title, either fighting Evander Holyfield or Bob Zazaz at cruiserweight, and instead he ended up fighting Iran Barkley, and you know,
needing to avenge his loss previously, his knockout loss, actually.
Yeah, in '88, and you didn't remember how vicious that KO we spoke of that was. And you know, when they fought in 1992, Barkley just seemed to still have Tommy's number. He beat him again. Tommy did much better this time, mind you, and it's a very close decision. But Barkley beat him again, and I think in the immediate aftermath of that, Harold Smith disappeared from his team, and then shortly after that, you know, I think Tommy got fed up that like Shearer wasn't able to get him the big fights he needed. You know, he didn't secure a big name, and you know, Tommy ended up sitting, like, you know, dismissed him after that as well, and he ended up sitting out a long time and just letting his injuries heal up, and you know, because he had hand injuries at the time. And when he did come back, you know, he made peace with Manny Stewart, and you know, he returned to the cronk where he'd missed, and you know, he went on then kind of another little bit of a tear where he had a couple of quick wins, and you know, won some minor titles up a cruiserweight. He won the like NABF title and the WBU title, and you know, I think he was looking at that time for he was looking for a big fight, you know, with one of the like main cruiserweight champions, or you know, he had an eye on James Toney and Roy Jones then super middleweight as well even, and he experimented with some promoting at that time, and the idea was kind of to use him to prop up, you know, the talent he was putting on the undercard. And I think the bout he promoted, it was like him against Earl Butler. The show didn't do very well. He didn't look good in it. And, you know, ultimately, I think USA Network ended up pulling the plug on their kind of deal with him, because there was kind of a lot of criticisms like, how can you let this guy still be fighting on at this stage and risking his health? And, you know, because of that, you know, the doors started to slam shut for Tommy. You know, and when he did come back, it was like he had a couple of very low-key fights, which he won. And like at that stage, Stewart and the rest of the team around him were kind of like, Tommy, do we still need to be doing this really? And, you know, he thought about it. He took nearly 2 years out of sport, and then at the age of 40, he decided, yeah, I do. I want to give it one last go. And he, you know, he came back with a quick win on like a Stewart promoted card, a small Stewart promoted card in Detroit. And then he went over to Manchester to, like, a Stewart was training Nassim Hamad at the time.
That's the fight I was going to ask you about. Do you remember that being a big thing back then?
I don't really remember it being a big thing at the time, and I like, just from what I hear is that you know, Tommy labored to a pretty uneventful win, and you know, I think people who were kind of coming expecting the great Tommy Hearns were left a bit disappointed, and I think they kind of knew at that point that we don't have that long left, and he was kind of angling for a last farewell fight in Detroit, and they got it. They put him in with Uriah Grant, who was a kind of another veteran, and the people of Detroit came out for it. Like 10,000 tickets sold for the Joe Louis Arena to say farewell to Tommy. But it ended up being a little bit of a disaster because he sprained his ankle in the third round and had to be pulled out. And I think afterwards Manny and Tommy were both kind of like, I don't want that to be the last memory of this career. But on Tommy's side, he was determined to get back in the ring. But Manny was kind of like, look, we've sold people on that being the farewell fight. I don't know if we can sell them on another farewell fight. But they actually did. It took like 5 or 6 years before he came back. But he got 2 last fights back in Detroit in 2005 and 2006. And he won them both by KO. And both of those times he shared the bill with his son, Ronald Hearns, who was kind of a junior middleweight contender for a few years. He used Tommy's old name of the Motor City Cobra. And, in that last fight in February of 2006, he was 48 years old going into it. And he had kind of a fairly uneventful performance for the most part. But then, in the 10th and final round, he turned on the style and closed out the show. He finished with the knockout in the last round. And that's how he ended his career, and he was the only one of the 4 kings who went out that way with a win.
So let's quickly, I know you want to talk a little bit about the trainers and such, and then we'll go on to the last part of the show.
Okay, yeah. So I did just want to kind of close out kind of on, because the trainers were a big part of this series and a big part of the character of this series, I think. So I just want to kind of go finish out where their careers finished up. Ray Arcel, Roberto Duran's coach, he ended up passing away in 94. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 91. He never worked again with Duran after the Benitez fight. But he did train Larry Holmes along with Eddie Futch for the Jerry Cooney fight. So he did have still some involvement in boxing after that. And, Kimball kind of remarks in his book that, James J. Braddock was his first heavyweight champion and Holmes was his last. And, if you think of what a career that covers, it's like Braddock won the title in 1935, and I think Holmes against Cooney was 82.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So that covers some amount of ground. The person who was side by side with him the whole way with Duran, Freddie Brown, he never returned to boxing again after No Mas. He eventually passed away. He never worked another corner again, and he did pass away in 86. Roberto's longtime trainer then, Plomo, who was with Roberto for his entire career. He started with him as an 8-year-old and finished with him as a 50-year-old man. He stayed in boxing for the rest of his life. He ended up passing away in, 2012 at the age of 81. But, he was always involved in sport up until his death. Onto Marvin's team, you had the Petronelli brothers both passed away within a few months of each other. Pat passed away in September 2011, and Goody passed away in January 2012. And they stayed involved in boxing, but they never had another world champion after Marvin. But they were kind of involved with a few interesting things. They did train Steve Collins, who would go on to be a world champion. He would return back to Ireland by the time he became a champion in middleweight and super middleweight. But they trained him in the early part of his career. Collins was one of the great middleweights in the 90s. And and also the other fight they were involved in was Mike Tyson's last fight. They were the trainers for Kevin McBride. And I think, just kind of an interesting part of that that links these guys back together again is somebody who was in Tyson's team at that point was Roberto Duran.
That's amazing.
Tyson looked up to Duran so much, in the last
for
few years he brought him, he'd like to have Roberto around his camp. Then obviously Tommy's trainer, Manny Stewart, he also passed away in 2012. Manny was inducted into Hall of Fame in 1996. He was a commentator for many years on HBO. He did just a great job there. He trained over 30 world champions. I think, the ones people most associate with him in the later part of his career are Lennox Lewis and Vladimir Klitschko. But, he's also involved with Oscar and Julio Cesar Chavez and Nas and Jermaine Taylor and a number of other guys. And, also another guy another couple of guys who went on to have title wins after he passed away. Adonis Stevenson beat Chad Dawson in 2013 or 2014 to win the light heavyweight title. And then, one thing that Manny, I think, always wanted to do was train a European fighter from, take him from from straight out of the amateurs and bring him right to world title level. And, he'd been planning to do that with Andy Lee, who was very close with him. And, Andy Lee lived with Manny for many years, and, they kind of had a father-son relationship. But, Manny didn't get to see Lee become a champion during his lifetime, but a couple of years later in 2014 he did beat Matt Korobov. So that was one more champion for him. And I guess then on to the last guy to talk about is Angelo Dundee. And he didn't get back with Leonard for those last two fights. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in '94. That same year, he worked George Foreman's corner when he became the oldest heavyweight champion of all time, beating Michael Moore.
Absolutely.
And he was never too far away from the sport, I don't think, after that. The last fight I remember him being a part of, Angie also passed away in 2012. So that's, Goody Petronelli, Plomo, Manny Stewart, and Angie all passed away in the same year. But the last big fight I can remember him being involved in was De La Hoya Pacquiao.
Ah. Yes, that's amazing. And there's a connection from that fight to this series in a way, in that you probably don't even remember this, but I'm trying to figure out where you're going here.
We started this website back in 1998, and that was when Four Kings came out. And one of the first super fights we previewed was De La Hoya Pacquiao.
Sure.
And George Kimball contributed to that preview, and I just thought that was super cool at the time that George would help us out like that and get involved. And it was shortly, a day or two after that, I saw Four Kings in my local bookstore, and I picked it up. And that's probably a huge part of the reason we're doing this series now, probably more than anything else.
What even came, how did I even just reach out or find his email address and reach out to him? I don't even remember how that happened.
I don't know. Yeah, I can't remember either. But I just thought that was an interesting way to kind of tie this whole thing together.
Yeah, that's amazing. That the inspiration obviously comes from that book, and also when I started to get back into boxing, when we did create this website, one of the things I wanted to do was look back at a lot of the fights from the 80s, because when I was growing up, we have a lot of product on TV today, but back when I was growing up, there was a lot of product then as well. You would see a lot of fights on ESPN. There was Tuesday Night Fights on USA. And then, Wide World of Sports, and then HBO. So there was a lot of product back then too. But for whatever reason, when you're growing up and when you're younger, everything seems so bigger than life. And I always saw specifically Ray as just this bigger than life sports celebrity. And I always then when I bought that book, I was like, man, I really want to just go back and learn everything there is to learn about this time frame. And, that was really the impetus of doing this. And, it took us a little while to get this thing going. But, that was why. And George, obviously, being a very nice person, like I said, like you said, I just literally just reached out to him to get like a preview. Like, I never thought he would write back or even like, give me any of his words. I did that to a few people out there as well, way back then. But okay, so thanks for tying all that together. Now, the last part of this is I just want to ask you a few questions about the series now that we're all the way through it. If you could go back in time, of all of the fights between our four pals, which one would you want to go back in time to attend live in person?
I've got a few that I would like. I was debating between on this, and one of them is just if you could go to any of these fights, actually, it would just be an amazing story to tell. But could you imagine if you were at the No Mask fight and just having the perspective of what people had while that was going down at the time? I just think that would have been fascinating. That would not have been my choice. But when I was in New Orleans last year and I was in the Superdome, that was something that played through my mind. I was thinking, oh wait, this is where the No Mask fight took place. And I think that would be it's just one of those weird moments in boxing history that's so a part of the sport that it would have been really interesting to be a part of. And then, another one that would be kind of in consideration would obviously be Hagler Hearns, which is just one of the great shootouts of all time. And, you look at it as the two most dangerous guys out there. And, whenever, it's kind of the fight they build every super fight up to be, where it's you're going to get these two guys just going at it from the first bell, and pretty much no fight ever is that. This was the one that was that. But I think my choice for this would be Leonard Hagler. And I think the reason for that is just because to this day the decision is debated so much. I'd love to have the perspective of having been in the arena for it, because I think sometimes you have a different feeling when you're in the arena. I've been at shows where there's a super close fight and people will debate it one way or the other afterwards, and you kind of feel like if you were at it, you go, look, I know I was in the arena that night, I know what happened. And I feel like that's just that little bit extra that people who were lucky enough to be at that fight just have that little bit of extra perspective. And I'd love to know, what anyone who was at it, felt how they scored it on the night. What was the feeling in the arena? 'Cause I think sometimes when you're at it, just something else seeps into it. You just get a different perspective of whose night it is by the time the final bell rings.
That's a great pick, and I think I was debating between Hagler Hearns and Leonard Hagler, very much, and I was leaning very much your way, not for the exact same reason, but just because the event was hyped up, so much over the years as never happening, and then not happening, and then finally happening. And I think there was an interesting story there with, how could Leonard possibly win at this point in his career? And I love that narrative of that fight, but I think it's number 2 for me, and I would probably say Hagler Hearns, because it's just one of the greatest, short fights of all time. And I would love to be somewhere where someone says, what's the best event you've ever been to? And I could go, oh, Hagler Hearns, obviously. That would be a kind of a cool thing to say. So that'd be my pick. But I'm right there with you with the other fight. So someone who listens to our show, who I also know fairly well, his name is Darren, aka Daza. He had this question, and I told him I would ask you on the air, which is, if you could have one more match between two of the four, which rematch would you have? And you could also pick what time frame. So it doesn't mean like they have to be over the hill and you could rematch them. But what match or what fight should have had an extra fight between the two guys?
Okay, I'm going to go with two of these, right? Because one of them's an obvious choice and one of them's a less obvious choice. So the first one that's the obvious choice would be Leonard Hagler, right? And that could have happened at two times. One would be an immediate rematch after the first fight, because usually if you rematch a fight quickly, the result becomes more magnified second times around. I think you would have got a clear winner and loser. You know, the knowledge that's gained in that first fight, you know, it plays into the second fight. Any little advantages one guy has, they become more pronounced second time around. And the other time that I would have liked to see that fight would have been, you know, if it had happened a few years earlier, if it had happened like somewhere around the timeline of when Hagler Duran happened and Hagler Hearns happened, rather than happening as late as it did. So when Marvin was a little bit fresher, how things would have shaken out differently. The other one, which is kind of going to be probably from left field a little bit, is just because of how the fight went down, is Duran Hearns. Because I think when they met in 84, you got Hearns at his very best and probably Duran at close to his worst. And I think if you had got them at any other time, they would have probably been on more of an even keel. And when you look at those two guys, they're probably the two most exciting guys in the series. You've got Hearns as the sharpshooter and Duran just as the rough, tough brawler. I feel like on a different timeline, there could have been a really good matchup between them at some point as well.
So I'm going to answer my answer with an actual question for you, which is, at any point in their careers, do you think Hearns could have actually beaten Hagler?
Hearns could have beaten Hagler, no.
Yeah, that's my answer too. Though, and that's why it's kind of hard to say I would have wanted to see a rematch, because I don't know if he could beat Marvin. But you know, to have a rematch of like of a fight like that would be amazing. But I think my answer is the same as yours, which is Leonard Hagler. And if the hard part is like you said, if it happens in 85, then you could do the rematch in 87. But because Leonard didn't really want that fight until he had it in 88, if they do it a year later, I kind of feel like it would be almost the exact same fight.
It might have been. Like, I think just that story's left so untold, because we don't know how Marvin would have came back, because we never saw him again.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, two more. I think this one is maybe not as predictable as I think. What was your favorite fight of the series?
Okay, I think you're probably... What were you going to predict?
Well, I think the easy answer is Hagler Hearns, because that's what people will remember most, though I think both of our answers may be slightly different than that. Yeah,
like going into it, that's something that my opinion changed on going into this. Like, Hagler Hearns would have been my favorite fight going into this series. And just because it is such a great short fight. And I still think that, like, if I want to make a boxing fan in one fight, that's the fight I showed him. But, you know, there were two others that, I really love even more. And one of them, which isn't my choice, but it's, like, very much a type of fight I like, is the first Leonard Hearns. Because, like, my favorite type of fight in boxing is where you have one guy up on the cards and the other guy has to chase and gets the late stoppage to turn it around. And that's exciting when it happens today. And, like, you know, you see 11th or 12th round stoppage for, like, you know, a guy who's behind in a fight. But, like, that's just even magnified when you move it to, like, that was the 14th round when Leonard finally caught up with Tommy. Like, it just made it that bit more epic. But my choice is actually the very first fight of the series. It's Leonard Duran, and I just think, like, as a fight, it may be not. I don't think it's the best action fight. I think the other two fights are better fights, even though it's a very good fight. But I just think the story aspect of it elevates it for me. I just think the whole kind of mystique around Roberto, and he's the one who interested me most throughout this series. And just when he went into this fight with Leonard, giving up pretty much all the advantages and still fighting one of the greatest fighters of all time and still somehow managing to upset the apple cart, it's just a superhuman performance. And I think that's my favorite story of the whole tournament.
So those were going to be two. So I had three, and I think I'm going to flip-flop yours, and I think my favorite fight is Leonard Hearns, because I think, when I look at this series, and this is kind of going to lead into our last question, and then we'll wrap it up, but I'm looking for the person who I rooted for the hardest. And some of this is just manipulation of personality and everything, but I think I rooted for Ray the hardest. And this fight is really a testament to what made him great, because he's losing the thing, right? And he had just conquered Duran, which was a tremendous hurdle for him, and he's coming back with Tommy, and it's like, oh shit, I may have met my match here, and he has to come back and dig deep to stop Tommy. And the other thing is that some folks will say that the actual narrative is that Tommy lost this fight rather than Sugar Ray won this fight, and I think you could make arguments for both, but it is the fact that Leonard digs deep and shows the true greatness that he had, and I think that's my favorite fight, just because both these guys are just flipping ridiculous in this fight, but also because Ray digs deep and wins, and I'm rooting for him. I'm like, knowing this fight is so many years ago, I'm like, with him the whole time as he makes his comeback. And so I think that would be my pick. So that now leads me into the last question, and we'll wrap this thing up, which is, who is the MVP for you of this era?
Ray Leonard. I think it has to be, just because without him, I don't think any of the others would have risen to the level that they did. I don't think the interest would have been there the way it was. I think he was he was the golden boy, and he was what elevated all the others in the tournament.
I absolutely agree with you, and he is like, if not for his marketability and his businessmanship, if that is even a word, a lot of this stuff isn't as big as it turns out to be, and I definitely think he's the MVP. Now, who the best fighter is actually a little bit of a different conversation, and I didn't want to go there because it's I think everyone is great, right? Like, all four of these guys are great, and you have to kind of look at that question only in a short amount of time, and I think that would do injustice for the entirities of their career. So I didn't want to go there, but I did think the MVP question was a good one, because it just shows us why we remember this the way that we do, and why we can actually go back and rewatch it and just be just as excited doing so as anything in the current time frame.
Okay, I got one last question for you.
Shoot, go for
it. Who would you match these guys up with from the eras that have gone by since?
That is crazy. And I think people would say like Mayweather and Leonard, but I wouldn't actually want to see that fight because I don't think Floyd would necessarily take the chances that Ray would in similar situation.
What about Oscar instead? Like, we talked about it as a fight that could have potentially happened. What if it was a peak Oscar against a peak Leonard?
That is an amazing fight, but I actually think now Leonard has a bit of size on him, but Leonard Pacquiao would have been amazing because Pacquiao doesn't stop coming forward, and he would force Leonard to get into situations where Leonard would have to dig deep. And I think that's like the best Sugar Ray is when he had to dig deep and really fight. Because he's from a skill level, he was just so much better than most guys that he could outbox them, and really make people look bad because of the hand speed, because of the footwork. But Manny would really force Leonard to have to fight, and I think that would be amazing. But De La Hoya as well. De La Hoya would be great as well because he's matched up, I think, very well from just a body type. He's probably the hand speed and the foot speed is not as good, but Oscar worked, and Oscar was not going to let someone outbox him the way that Ray may have outboxed other guys. What about you?
It's interesting. Like, the one I thought of for Pacquiao was actually because he was a smaller guy moving up was Duran. Like, Duran Pacquiao at lightweight would have been the fight for me to make.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. That's an absolutely ridiculous fight.
For Hagler, there's a few that I thought of, just the two old grizzled veterans and him and Bernard Hopkins.
That's the one that I thought about too. At what weight though? What, just right at middleweight?
Yeah, but then also and this is another one that's kind of, there's two middleweights who've emerged during the time we've been doing this series, which is Triple G and Canelo. Either of those guys against Hagler would be a fun fight as well. I
think Hagler's too mean for Canelo.
he might just be.
Okay, so then how do you match someone up with Tommy? Because his body is his length and his power is so ridiculous. Like, who do you put with him?
For me, I would go with the opposite, and Miguel Cotto.
That's interesting.
You go with the rangy Tommy against the compact Cotto. To think Cotto's problem was generally cutting off the ring, but if he could get in against a larger fighter, but if he could get in close to somebody as slim as Tommy and land those body shots, he'd be in the fight. So that's the one I would make for Tommy. I think that's an interesting styles matchup.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, I mean, because Hearns is just so different. But okay, so we have put in hours and hours of work into this series. I think my hope, at least, is that as the series grew, I think the listenership grew, and I hope that this provides a little bit of something that people, as they gain interest in this era, new fight fans, that they go back and listen to these, because we it's not because we put work into it. It's actually fun for me. It's something that I look forward to, so it doesn't even feel like work. But just the overall, I think we covered it in a way that was very thorough. We utilized more than just the Kimball resource. I mean, we were researching different books now, and I know Kimball used Sports Illustrated a lot as some of his reference point, and I went back to all of those Sports Illustrated articles too. So I think we covered it in a very thorough way. And there if there were points that we missed, there's not many of them, because we dug deep and really looked at this as deeply as possible. But the thing that I want to say before we end this is thank you to Duan, because he is such a not only is Duan a wealth of knowledge, but Duan's fandom of boxing is just amazing. Like Duan watches so much boxing. And so to do this with someone like Duan was a ton of fun because, you know, my sports interests are spread so far and wide that, you know, I would never call myself like a boxing historian or a boxing expert. But, you know, Duan, you know, if Duan said that he was that, I would go, yeah, you're right. You know, there are a few people in our circles, you know, Matt Prentice and Robert Silva as well. You guys do such a great job of following the sport so closely. So I just want to say that I appreciate you, Duan, for doing this with me because, you know, it's not really about like learning stuff. It's just more about doing something with someone who's so passionate that it just makes it worth it for me. So I just wanted to say that before we get out of here.
No, and I think, you know, in all the time we've been doing the website, I think this is my favorite thing we've done. You know, I have learned a lot through doing it. And, you know, I've just, as I said at the start of the show, I gained such a greater appreciation for these guys. The more I just kind of looked into their stories and learned about them. And, you know, also just how much admiration I have for that book Kimball put out. You know, I think there's a lot of great books been written on the sport of boxing. I think, you know, it's a sport that just lends itself to, you know, some great journalism and some great media. But, you know, I don't like that's my favorite one of the lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, thanks to Duan. I'm Double G. And thanks for listening to everybody. I hope that we can revisit some of these, you know, do something again down the line. But I think, you know, in all of these shows, we have a nice beginning and this is the end of it. And yeah, I really appreciate everything. I appreciate everyone for listening. And that's the cap on this. Thanks, Duan.